Good morning. This meeting of the Conflicts of Interest Board is being conducted pursuant to New York State Open Meetings Law, Public Officers Law, Section 100 et sec. For purposes of this meeting, I shall designate Julia Lee as recording secretary. Today we have before us consideration of the following two items. First, adoption of proposed Board Rule 1-13, and second, proposed amendments to Title 53 of the Rules of the City of New York, Board Rule Chapter 3. Turning first to Board Rule 1-13. As I understand it, this is the move from having everything being proposed to the public and then having gone through a process of public comment and public meeting to moving from proposed to adopting. So they're getting rid of the proposed, changing the tense from would define to define, and in effect converting this from a proposal into a final rule. And as far as I understand, there is nothing substantive in the changes, indeed nothing stylistic other than those things that converted from a proposal to a final item. Any comments from the board or staff on the adoption of proposed Board Rule 1-13? There being no discussion, I call for a motion that the board adopt proposed Board Rule 1-13.
Second.
Motion, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? None? Well, the motion for adoption of Board Rule 1-13 as presented as the final rule has passed. Okay. We also have before us consideration of proposed amendments to Board Rule Chapter 3. With this, there have been a few changes since before, so I'm going to ask Chris Hammer to briefly go over the changes that we have in front of us.
Thank you. In 2017, the board began the process of drafting board rules to implement Chapter 9 of Title 3 of the Administrative Code, the law regulating not-for-profit organizations affiliated with elected officials. Since these board rules took effect in early 2018, board staff has begun training and advising affiliated organizations of the requirements of Chapter 9 and has received feedback about the law and the board rules, both informally and at a recent city council hearing on the record at which many organizations testified. Staff has heard this feedback and in an effort to be as responsive as we can with the law as it is written, proposes to amend the board rules. These amendments fall into two categories. First, they would clarify the factors by which the board determines whether an organization is affiliated with an elected official. And second, they would simplify the process by which an organization reports information about its donors' household members, a part of the law that the organizations found particularly onerous. These amendments thus intend to make the rules clearer and to balance the need for transparency with the need for practical administration of the law.
Okay, as I understand it, there are three specific changes. Maybe we should break up the discussion and do it one change at a time. The first one, and I guess I am working off of Exhibit 3. I guess we could also use Exhibit 4, but I think Exhibit 3 is nicely marked. Exhibit 3, page 4. So the first change is in terms of the factors that go into the board's determination of whether an entity is affiliated with an elected official. The current proposal says whether the organization was created by one of a list of elected officials. The proposed revision clarifies that it's created by a person currently holding that office, not a former mayor or former borough president, but the current mayor, current member of city council, etc. This strikes me as very straightforward and sensible, but does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns about this one?
Is this something that's authorized by the local law?
Yes, the local law permits the board to clarify the factors that is expressly provided in the law.
Including adding the language that to call out entities that were established by current officials.
That's right.
That's a substantial.
Yes, that's right. the administrative law, section 3901, the definition of organization affiliated with an elected officials gives the board that discretion.
Okay, we'll collect it all at the end, but I thought we'd just break the discussion up into 3 parts. The second is on the same page, also going into the factors determining by which the board will determine whether an entity is affiliated with an elected official, is to, in effect, revise the final consideration, which the first version said the purpose of the organization, but didn't particularly clarify what was meant by that or which way purpose would cut. It's to propose new language that says whether the purpose of the organization advances either the mission of a city agency under the control of the elected official or the political interests of the elected official, which I think has the nice virtue of sharpening up why we're asking about purpose. I think one of our questions previously was, in some sense, where is that factor going? It also makes it more consistent with, in form at least, with the other criteria, all but one of which begins with a whether. And again, I think it also sort of emphasizes the way in which the purpose is designed to illuminate. So I think that seems sensible and straightforward, but again, questions or comments?
I've got one again. Is it enough to just simply to include mission of the city agency as political interests? I mean, political is a term that can be very broad, I understand. Also, the statute excludes political committees, so it's not that.
Yes.
But aren't there other interests that these bodies could propose that are not interests of the city agency? I mean, that they're not political, that they could be things like gun control, environment, income inequality, health. That maybe there's another rubric under which these would be created that are not the city agency's purposes, but are not political purposes per se.
Sure, maybe to advance political or policy interests, something to an effect. But as intended, political is sort of broad and inchoate in order to encompass that already. Partly because electoral politics are, for the most part, expressly excluded by the law.
You're imagining something that's sort of along the lines of advocating for policy or something like that might not be somehow
It's not
not
going to be
related.
created for purely political purposes, or at least ostensibly created for those purposes. So they're going to be for even the organization that gave rise to all this. I mean, they were goals that were being pursued. So if a public official wants to establish a corporation to raise money to promote gun control or health initiatives, mental health, for example, or others. This should be broad. I know the word political could encompass all that. I understand.
I may.
But maybe another term as well. Policy.
Well, I may also suggest.
Why is that not political or policy?
Political or policy interests would be, I think.
Does that do the trick for you, Jeff?
I think it goes a distance. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Makes sense to me. That any further thoughts on it? I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree.
I think I misspoke when I said 3. There were actually 4 items. The next item also in the criteria the factors by which the board will determine whether an entity is affiliated with an elected official would be a new one. Whether multiple elected officials serve on the board of the organization, which, as I understand it from the write-up, is designed to make it less likely that it's controlled by any one of them. And so therefore, I think if it turned out that multiple officials were, it would make it less likely that the organization would be seen as affiliated with any one of them. Is that, I understand that is the purpose of that amendment?
Yes.
Did that come out of any comment, or does that just come out of the kinds of issues that that the board has had to deal with in thinking about implementation?
Well, it came out of our experiences in looking at the makeup of many organizations throughout the city,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them have boards by which multiple elected officials serve ex officio on the board of directors. And
So let me interrupt. So let's say it says, the charter of the entity says the mayor, the borough president, and the local council members.
Yes.
That would be one example?
that's one example, yes.
Okay.
And it is less likely that any one of them is exercising control over the organization, unless, there certainly could be envisioning circumstances that one of the elected officials has an outsized role, but on balance, the presence of multiple elected officials is sort of a check, if you will, on any one of them exerting control.
Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, then let's move on to what I believe is the fourth and last item is maybe the most significant, I don't know, is when we get, is an amendment to section 304, annual reporting by organizations affiliated with an elected official. The relevant changes are on pages 6 and 7 of Exhibit 3, which is dealing with the question of whether a member of the household of a donor, whether a donor is a member of the household of a person who falls into the doing business category. And the question is how, and the issue that comes up is how to, what's the duty of the organization to report concerning somebody who might be with a situation where the donor is the member of the household of somebody who falls into the doing business category. The original proposal, which you've got on 6 and 7, was to require the organization to do a bunch of things, to consult with a bunch of individuals and entities, to check its own records, check name of the doing business registry, and then also to reach out to contact various people with the organization and its board members and its principal officers. The proposal here is to get rid of that last part of it, the additional reaching out beyond checking the records of the organization on the theory that it's too burdensome. And I take it this is something that many of the organizations have raised, or maybe I should put that into a question. Have organizations raised that? And then the question that naturally arises, is this make it too likely that household members will not be discovered? So tell us a little bit about, to the extent this is a response to requests or concerns raised by entities, and then address, if you can address a little bit the question of, do we think this leaves this under-researched and under-investigated?
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to. Basically, the answer to the first part of your question is yes. The organizations have expressed, to us, both informally and at the hearing, that the reporting requirements are very burdensome, and in particular, this one, because this information is not ordinarily in the normal course of business given to most, if not all, of these people, where where every donation of $25 or $50 or these minor amounts are relatively small amounts. That's not delineated line by line in the way that that this rule currently requires, and so that creates an additional burden not only on the staffs of these organizations, many of which are small and are trying to do as much as they can with the resources that they already have, and also the time of the board members of the organizations, who also have very busy professional lives, to go line by line through each of these donations, and so because the organizations often have their fundraising records, in part of their job is their role to ensure their ability to continue to do their work is fundraising, and so they have a strong interest in keeping their records as robust as possible in order to ensure the continuing development of the organization. And so we feel that in balancing the significant burden on individuals' time and labor with the the need for transparency and the extent to which the records already exist within the organization's records without the need to consult the individuals listed in the rule, that we don't believe the transparency, the additional names of household members that may come out through the process will arise in very significant numbers.
And how nervous are we that people are going to get missed? And let me ask one other question and I'll stop. Did we think of, the staff think about splitting this as between the restricted and the unrestricted organizations, that we may have less of a need to know with respect to the unrestricted organizations, which are, I don't know, the one, the Fund for Parks or the Fund for Public Housing, versus the restricted organizations, which are the ones which are actually doing some more political work on behalf of elected officials, that are using the elected official's name in a certain percentage of their communications. And is it I'm guessing that much of the objection is coming from the unrestricted organizations, the Friends of the Parks, and maybe we would want to have this, because as I said, it's in one place, it's really in two places, of course.
Yes.
It's in sub A, which is for restricteds, and sub B for unrestricteds. Would we think about doing what you're proposing for the unrestricteds, but leaving the higher data gathering requirement for the restricteds? Did that come up?
That did not come up in our staff conversations, but it's certainly a policy that the board could adopt. Particularly, I mean, in implementing this law, we feel that every organization has a very, very, very strong interest to ensure that they are unrestricted, and so we believe there will be very few, if any, organizations that fall into the restricted category, and so they didn't particularly enter into the conversation about the rules, but certainly the board could determine that yes, we want to have this additional information from if any comes out of it from the restricted organizations.
I think this
Let
is
me throw it open.
Yeah, I think this is a related question to, like, is there a way to just not delete this requirement for making an inquiry altogether and just soften it somewhat? Like, could there be, for aggregate donations above a certain amount, the organization has the duty to actually inquire as to whether any household members, are on the list? It seems like we're saying, if the organization believes that, X, Y, Z, but what is the basis for that belief other than just not inquiring at all? So I feel like there's got to be some, or maybe a notice that says donations.
Yeah, I think before we had an affirmative duty of inquiry.
Yes.
Right.
Which I agree might have been too burdensome.
Yes.
And now we're
Right.
shifting to, I think we're toying with the idea of some sort of inquiry notice, reasonable person standard, right?
I think it's less than
Or is
that.
No,
It's
it
just-
went
just
right
look at-
to you
look at
just
your
have a
records.
head in the
Just look at your-
sand, but you
Just look at your
believe.
records.
Right.
Look at your records and see if and see what the donors have said. And if the donor didn't say, I'm the spouse of somebody who's the city's largest contractor.
Well,
But are
that-
they asking, are the records asking for that disclosure to be made? That's my
But we
point.
also wouldn't be comfortable with them turning a blind eye,
Right.
right? So if they're on notice of fact suggesting,
But how would you be on notice if you don't have a duty to even inquire about household members?
well, there's a
pardon me.
difference between having a duty to inquire and the duty that arises after you've been on notice of certain facts.
So part of this conversation arose because the law as it's written does not permit us to permit the board to require the unrestricted organizations to inquire of their donors whether they are
Where they have household members?
whether they are household members doing business, because the law already creates that duty for restricted organizations. As written, we are not, the board is not permitted to provide a rule that would require unrestricted organizations to actively, to inquire of their donors. And so that's back in 2017, as we were working through the text of the law, that was one of the conundrums of implementing the law that gave rise to this procedure.
That is to say, because we could not require unrestricted organizations to ask their donors this question.
Which restricted organizations are required to.
Yes.
Right. We, the rules were drafted to require them to, how do we know what an organization knows? Well, we drafted these rules to require them to take these
Some
additional
affirmative
right.
steps
So
to
confirm-
figure it out. And
Right.
they're saying it's too much, we can't do all those things.
Right, because they're required to do this, essentially all the time as donations are coming in, and it's.
So I hear that and I get that and I see the big proposed deletion.
Okay.
But then my concern comes up in the next section where it says if an organization believes XYZ is not a person with business dealings with the city. But so what is the basis for that belief?
Oh.
If we're eliminating any requirement to actually find out? Like,
Right,
so how
I
do
think
we
it's
believe?
exactly what Chris was talking about earlier, which is these are organizations that have, they spend a considerable amount of their time and resources fundraising, and the records that they keep for doing that work are really pretty essential to their
You might
success.
Yes,
know
you might
from your
know.
existing records. is what
Exactly,
you're
exactly.
saying.
And I would add that current Romanet 4, which under the proposal would become Romanet 3, that is, that's
what they're
simply
called?
that's simply,
They called Romanettes?
yes, that,
I always thought they were just little two.
Little I, little T,
Oh,
yeah,
Romanet.
whatever. Little I.
My day is made.
That's
Great.
right.
Um,
Learn something every day.
that section, that paragraph is simply there to create a process by which two people with the same name, one of whom is in the doing business database, one of whom is not, that can be determined by the board. Yes, this is the same person. This is not the same person. So that's really aside from the question of the process by which the organization is fulfilling its reporting obligations. That's more to say, look, if you get a match and you don't think the person has anything to do with this person of the same name that's matching, come to us and we will help you resolve it. And the change from concludes to believes that's in that paragraph is only there. That change has been made because the organization's not necessarily concluding anything. The board is ultimately the entity that's making the conclusion as to whether a donation should be reportable as coming from someone with business dealings with the city or not.
If I understand you, this
Yeah.
requirement to make these inquiries only applies to restricted organizations.
No, it applies to both restricted and unrestricted organizations.
Correct.
The board can decide whether to take away that or remove that obligation for both types of organizations or just unrestricted organizations. But presently, it applies to both unrestricted and restricted organizations.
The statute prohibits us from doing this with regard to
The unrestricted.
unrestricted.
Yes.
The
Somebody
statute,
said-
Yes.
Yeah, the statute allows for, in fact requires restricted organizations to make an inquiry of their donors about who their household members are.
To use a form.
Right.
Right.
It's a form, it's not an inquiry, it's the form.
Right.
Right, to use a form. The law does not permit us to have that same requirement for unrestricted organizations.
Right.
So this checking with the leadership, which we colloquially will call check with chiefs, a requirement was created in order to essentially try to make sure that we knew with tremendous certainty the answer to that question about the household members by requiring these organizations to conduct this internal inquiry.
For unrestricted organizations.
Right, for both, but yes.
Yeah, but for restricted organizations, we now have a process, right?
They have a process
They have
in
a
part.
process, right.
I should clarify that that requirement to give its donors a form is only required of donations that are $400 or more, while all donations of any amount coming from a person with business dealings with the city must be reported. And like with requiring unrestricted organizations to inquire, the board is also without authority to require restricted organizations that receive donations from somebody in less than the amount of $400 from making that inquiry. And so that's why, for making that inquiry of its donors. And so that's why the inquiry of its leadership is also included for restricted organizations in order to fill that gap of information.
But our greatest concern would be with restricted organizations.
Our greatest concern with understanding where the donations are
Right,
coming
right.
from is with restricted organizations. That's
Richard,
correct.
you open with that possibility.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it was the driving force for the law, as I understand it. I mean, to me, there's a balance here between avoiding undue burdening of organizations, many of which have been around for a long time and are picked up in this because of the way the statute is drafted and are, do have connections with city officials, which could conceivably be used by the city official for some purpose, but are often there to sort of help out with city agencies. And then the particular one of the organizations affiliated with a city official, really designed to promote the city official in some way, and that's what the statute catches that distinction by looking at the fraction of their communications that relate to the official, et cetera. I'm sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't really make the unrestricted organizations really kind of knock themselves out to track down every single dollar, especially since the bigger donations are going to be, we're going to have some information about them. Part of me thinks we might want to maintain that requirement in place for the restricted organizations, even if there are very few, because that is the major goal of this. And although if it's only catching things under $400, maybe it's not even essential for the restricteds. But I think it's maybe more faithful to the original intent of the city council to be as vigilant as possible with the restricteds and to be much more caring of the unrestricteds. So I would put on the table the idea of adopting the staff's proposal with respect to the unrestricteds, but not changing the current sort of due diligence requirement
So
for
that'll
the
be
restricteds.
keeping the romanette.
Right, keeping, in effect, striking the bracket.
Yes.
That's on the one line up from the bottom on page 7, and.
Which exhibit are you on?
Wait,
On exhibit 3. And so there's
No, the opposite.
no, wait, we keep it, here, this one, oh, yeah, you're right, I'm
Yes,
sorry, you're
so-
right. Striking,
So
On page 6?
On page
striking,
6.
you're right, striking the bracket in, after Romanet 3, towards the bottom of page 6, and then, I guess it was striking the "and" that was being inserted, because now 3
striking
is
the
kept.
"and" that's inserted,
And
yes.
then striking the bracket at right after Romanet 4.
Yes.
But leaving in, I guess, I'm willing to leave in the shift from concludes to believes. I don't know that matters much, but if you think that's useful, I would leave it in.
Yes, I think it's useful just as a clarifying that
They're not
they're
making a
not
final
concluding anything.
conclusion.
They're not making a final conclusion.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's ultimately the board's determination.
We good? Take a moment to ponder. Okay, so further discussion? Then I believe, let me sort of rephrase the language slightly. I believe that we are going to ask the staff to revise the proposal in 2 ways. One is with respect to the modification to 303 sub G on page 4 to insert the words "or policy" after the political, so it reads "or the political or policy interests of the elected official." And we're going to delete the brackets on pages 6 and 7 under 304A sub 5, Romanets 3 and 4, to maintain the search requirement, the information searching requirement for restricted organizations, while leaving in place the proposal to delete it for the unrestricted. So with those two modifications to the staff proposal, I call for a motion that the board adopt the recommended amendments to Board Rule Chapter 3 as the final rule with those two modifications just stated.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? A motion for adoption of the proposed amendments with the modification as discussed as the final rule has passed. There being no further business for consideration pursuant to the open meetings law, this meeting is hereby adjourned.